This is the first panel called One Step Ahead, and it's all about anticipating legal challenges in this changing environment.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you to Diana. Is this good? Is this too loud? Okay, we're feeling it. I love it. We're really happy to kick this off, and I really want to start by saying how incredibly pleased and honored we are to have you, Diana, and the Double Exposure Film Festival here. This is, to me, one of the most important film festivals that takes place in North America because of its focus on documentaries dealing with investigative journalism. I think in all times, but particularly right now. So it's an honor to get things kicked off. So if I could bring the panel up, if you would come on up, you get to choose your own seat. It's a choose your own adventure game here at Hopkins and with the Double Exposure Film Festival. So once they sit down, I'll introduce them. This is an incredible panel. We're going to start off, it's Renee Griffin, who's a staff attorney with the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, I'll sit down. There you go, I can sit down. So she focuses on rapid response to legal issues faced by journalists. What a great panel and time for you to be here. That's great, and she also has a lot of experience because she formerly clerked for the 10th Circuit of the U.S. Court of Appeals. So it's really great to have you here. We have next in line Allison Sherry. Allison is a partner at Davis Wright Tremaine. She focuses on media, entertainment, and IP. I'm very curious because she advises on high-risk projects, including scripted docudramas based on real-life stories, people, and projects. We definitely have to talk. But she also works on documentaries and docuseries and projects that rely heavily on fair use. So I know we have a lot of questions on that. We're very honored to have here Michael Ratner from NPR, where he is the Senior Assistant General Counsel and Data Protection Officer. He works on legal and journalism ethics issues and supervises First Amendment issues and litigation as well. And finally, someone who I had the chance to meet last year, I'm very excited also is on this panel. We have Mary Inman, who is a partner for Whistleblowers Partners in San Francisco. She has a great depth of experience, having worked 26 years on whistleblower issues. We're just very happy to have you back, Mary. And happy to have this panel here. I gotta say, it's always interesting. You can get the zeitgeist on the Times and a festival. The first panel they have is on lawyers. So there you go. But you heard how impressive the panel is here. So I really just want to get things kicked off and let you hear from them. And I want to say this too, particularly with the weather and where we are. What was great is we had a pre-panel discussion. And what was great is obviously we're facing a lot of challenges right now. I don't have to tell anybody that. But it was great to also hear that amidst these obstacles, there's also hope. So I'd love to focus on that. I'd love to ask and start with Mary, because she's sitting right next to me. And she's great. What do you see? Again, the title is The Shifting Legal Landscape here of our panel. What do you see as the big shifts, those obstacles, and also where are you finding hope right now?
Thank you. Honored to kick off here. So what I see as obstacles is that it has become increasingly difficult for whistleblowers to speak out. And that has created a number of issues. So you think about the Trump administration, one of the first acts that they took was to fire the head of the Office of Special Counsel, a gentleman by the name of Hampton Dillinger. And his job was to accept and deal with threats and discrimination in the federal workforce, and including dealing with claims about retaliation against whistleblowers. So it was a really quick move in February to to signal that that is not a valuable service. We also saw, obviously, with the firing of an unprecedented number of IGs. So the watchdogs, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, the watchdogs have been very much gone away. And I think information is now being super tightly held. I don't want to just cast aspersions at President Trump, because Obama was also very tight on going after leaks. But it's the the retribution campaign that really concerns me. There was a whistleblower named Miles Taylor. He was chief of the Department of Homeland Security under Trump 1. He was an anonymous source to a New York Times article in 2018. And one of the first acts of Trump 2 is to, start to investigate him for espionage. So it's that kind of chilling effect. It's always hard to be a whistleblower, but I think it's particularly difficult now. And so that's what concerns us. It spreads over from government, of course, to the signaling the Trump administration is doing is boldening big tech. We saw big tech sitting on the inauguration stand and being, at White House dinners and going to Windsor Castle in the case of Mark Benioff. So I think that we saw sort of a much, I think, I have the pleasure of representing Frances Haugen, one of the Facebook's whistleblowers, and Meta did not take action against her for theft of documents, all the traditional tactics that big tech could use, that Theranos and other organizations have used. It's a different Meta. So you see Sarah Wynne Williams, I'm sure a lot of you read her book, Careless People. I mean, they came after her hammer and tongs. So it's just a very difficult environment. And I think we're relying on more and more purple unicorns of these people who are going to be the David's versus Goliath. I think we're going to have a lot far fewer of them. So that's where I want to give you hope now, having just taken you all and said, well, this is horrible, because I often say that whistleblowers are, the fifth estate, and they play a really vital role. And if you look behind every news story, you're going to see a whistleblower. So is it dark days when there are fewer whistleblowers signaling? Yes. But we're not taking this sitting down. So to give you hope, there's two nonprofits I wanted to talk to you about that are doing some really innovative things right now. One of them, I sit as the board chair of a nonprofit called the Signals Network, which is seeking to collectivize the act of whistleblowing. And so recognizing that there's safety and strength in numbers. So you think about any of the big whistleblowing scandals, from emissions cheating to Boeing, there were multiple whistleblowers. So you can imagine one of the problems we have is a first mover problem. Like, who's going to be the first one to, speak out against the Goliath? And by trying to collectivize this, and we have a system that we're actually fighting tech with tech, where you pour in your information, hopefully into a safe, anonymously. You don't have to go full whistleblower, and only if you are matched with someone can you then consider whether you now want to go up together. It's sort of picking up very much off the Me Too model. So we're trying to do that as a way to increase the number of reports, and we're hearing a lot. If you look at the OpenAI whistleblowers, for instance, there were 13 that came forward at the time of the big coup where Altman was fired, rehired, and all of that, and they were very successful in showing that, not surprisingly, OpenAI had an NDA that was illegal and preventing people from going to the government. So there's hope. There's hope in collective action, everybody. So that's one piece. And then the other piece I want to call out is we also have Margot Ewan Margot, can you raise your hand, from the Signals Network here in the audience, and they are working very diligently, and I think just announced breaking news here that they have a partnership with the Reynolds Journalism Institute on how to protect sources. And so that's the other piece I'm sure we're going to get to today, is the need to make sure that these people who do have the temerity to speak up are protected and can do so safely in an age where AI surveillance has made it even harder for people. You can imagine, there's a lot of techniques now in companies where they're just combing for even certain signals, even key phrases in your in your emails that will mark you as a whistleblower. So the Signals Network staying on top of that, and then of course partnering with RJI, which is impressive. So you can talk to Margot afterwards if you have questions about that.
It's like our panel is growing. I love it. Margot, welcome. It's nice to have you here at the festival in Hopkins. It's great. Mike, obviously you're dealing with a lot at NPR and on many fronts. I would ask the same question, like, what are the challenges that you're really dealing with? And above, as part of that, also, what are the things you would most want to raise flags for documentarians and people coming to this stuff? And then also, where are you finding hope?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. In terms of the challenges are many, and I'll get to the hopeful part. Sort of big picture, the challenges are the number of challenges, and that includes executive orders. And I'm not here to speak for NPR, I'm here to speak for me. Executive orders, the Department of Justice has withdrawn and then sort of put in place new guidelines on subpoenaing journalists that are much more favorable to leak investigations. You see politicians suing for libel. You see settlements from large companies. You also see more libel claims from just individuals out there who are sort of inspired by these libel lawsuits to kind of come out of the woodwork. The list goes on to access challenges at the White House with AP. You've seen Pentagon access restrictions. So it's just a number of challenges. What's hopeful out there? I would say, if you take the Pentagon access challenges, you see that the media organizations, the fourth estate, and I like the idea of a fifth estate, the fourth estate, across what people consider mainstream media and even right-leaning or very conservative publications have pushed back against those restrictions. And that is hopeful to me. I think the boundaries that are being pushed are so deep into the fundamentals of what we believe are freedom of speech protections and freedom of the press that in some ways it is bringing people together and bringing organizations together to say that's not okay. So collective action and solidarity and just bravery is out there, and it's happening. And I think the important thing is that you have to push back. And as lawyers, that's sort of second nature to us. But I can't emphasize enough, there is no First Amendment fairy who's going to come down and save us. We have to fight back when there are challenges, and there have been wins so far, and there will continue to be. I also think that the number of challenges are sort of unprecedented. You hear that a lot. But many of the challenges themselves have precedent. So lots of libel claims. There was huge surge in libel claims during the Civil Rights era in the 1960s, and the Supreme Court established New York Times versus Sullivan, the actual malice standard if a public figure or a public official is suing. Those lawsuits came back with a vengeance in the 80s, and they were kind of going down, and now they're back up, right? So it's not like the first time we're dealing with these access restrictions during the LBJ administration, Nixon administration, George W. Bush administration, Obama administration. We have dealt with those. Subpoenas journalists, you could name the same administrations. It is not to say that these kinds of restrictions are okay. In fact, the precedents say they're not okay, but we're having to fight a bunch of these battles at the same time, and that's happening. And I guess most importantly, great journalism and great storytelling is happening at a massive scale. The courage of journalists and storytellers who are speaking truth to power in all the different ways is absolutely inspiring. And so I think we can take a lot of hope from that and get inspiration from that. So I keep that with you, I would say.
Thank you very much. And by the way, I just want you to know, if there was a First Amendment fairy, she would be here on this panel, okay? But that's really good to hear, and I definitely want to get to all the defamation stuff that's happening. Allison, obviously from the world of private practice, what are you seeing, from your perspective?
So I think so I do a lot of work with individual documentaries, filmmakers, podcasts, things like that, like actual project, kind of the longer I do the breaking news, but also kind of these longer projects. I think one challenge, which has always been a challenge and continues to be a challenge, is the really boring question of insurance, and finding ways to give filmmakers the safety net to tell those stories and not have it be so expensive to be right that it doesn't matter, because you can't stop people from suing just because you're in the right. Like the very act of having to defend a lawsuit can be ruinous. And there's been some really great effort. I was talking to Diana and I sent to her. I know there was like somebody had put together kind of a E&O insurance for smaller independent journalists and filmmakers. Obviously, if you have a distributor, you've got that behind you, but there's so much out there that doesn't, maybe you're making this and you don't know if anyone is going to pick it up and if they're going to give you insurance coverage for it. So I cannot stress enough that having access to insurance, I think is good, even if it's catastrophic, effectively, insurance. But I've definitely seen that it's harder and harder for independent filmmakers to get coverage for a specific project, that insurers are very skittish about covering things that I would have not batted they wouldn't have batted an eye at like 10 years ago. And I think especially in documentaries, when you're getting coverage for a specific project as opposed to like for your company where they're not like scrutinizing specifically what you're doing, it's especially difficult. And so it's been it's having a good kind of insurance broker, and I think that kind of thing is really important. The hopeful thing that I have seen, like Micah, is I think storytelling is always important, but is especially important right now because there's an avalanche of information, and that information can be difficult to process and wade through and assess the reliability of. And so being able to craft a narrative and tell a story and kind of synthesize that information in a way that is compelling, in a way that is memorable, in a way that is consistent, and like being able to tell a consistent story, and that kind of communications element of it is an extremely important skill in media literacy nowadays. It's not just like reporting what the facts are, because no one's going to believe you, but telling a story. And so storytellers are so important, and I really think that because there's a lot of different ways to get that story out there. It's maybe some of the more traditional distributors, it's more difficult, but there's a lot of really great filmmakers, storytellers, documentarians who are doing amazing work and getting it out there and forming new studios and forming new alliances and finding new ways to kind of tell those stories. And I think, institutions change, but good journalists and good filmmakers are kind of the constant, and the stories will out. So I think that's good job to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Allison. So Renee, what are you seeing? Obviously, the work you guys are doing with the reporters community is so vital. What are you seeing, and where are you finding hope in this?
Yeah, the reporters committee, we do work both at the national level. We do some advocacy related to Pentagon access issues, other large-scale interactions with the federal government. I work on our legal hotline and receive calls from independent journalists and filmmakers across the country who are facing issues on a much more local level. And so I think what that emphasizes is just that this is, as Micah emphasized, it's sort of a numerosity issue. It's happening everywhere, and to some degree it feels a little bit like sort of a trickle-down situation. There's this sort of anti-media, anti-press, anti-speech rhetoric from the top, and that gets replicated in local governments. You see county governments in Mississippi taking actions to suppress press access to public officials. You see it in the streets of Chicago and Los Angeles, journalists being potentially targeted just for covering protests. And so, to reiterate everything that's already been said about leak investigations and subpoenas and libel defense, these are all issues we've seen before, but they are major issues and coming up often and everywhere. So that is a challenge, I think, to make sure we have just enough lawyers across the country to address those issues as they come up and in a timely fashion when they do come up, wherever they come up. In terms of what is a little bit heartening is that so far I think that has happened. There have been people stepping up everywhere to try to respond as these things happen, and also to prepare in advance. My favorite thing on the legal hotline is not when I get a call immediately after someone's received a subpoena or been arrested, but they are in the process of news gathering or putting together a documentary and call me and say, what should I be thinking about as I am talking to potentially sensitive sources, as I'm going out on the streets to collect film for a project I'm working on. And then we can sort of talk it through in advance before anything comes up, because that makes a lawyer's life much easier when, a subpoena does or doesn't come, to say, okay, where is everything saved? Who has access to this? Things like that, that just might not be on a journalist or filmmaker's mind right away, but is often top of a lawyer's mind. And so those steps can be really helpful. And I'll also say, even in the reactive posture, when things go wrong, in Los Angeles and Chicago, there are lawyers and journalists and filmmakers bringing lawsuits really quickly to try to address those things, and judges are responding. There's a lot of, I think, fair criticism about the judiciary out there, but some of the legal opinions really chastising government officials for their behavior in a lot of these circumstances where they're suppressing press access or targeting journalists in the streets are really striking and worth reading, and give me, at least as a lawyer, a little bit of solace in thinking that there are people paying attention and trying to prevent these things from happening again.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you all. And actually, that was a tremendous transition, Renee. I can't thank you, because I was actually going to move it in two ways. So first of all, I want to say this. You guys all have microphones. We've done the nice one pass, everybody got to talk. Now I want to have like a real conversation. And as I transition, that was my next question, is we've got some documentarians and filmmakers and storytellers here. What are the things you're saying up front? Like, this is what you should be doing. Right? These are the practical steps you should be taking to protect yourself right from the get-go. And I would love to hear that. And again, I think this could be a free-flowing conversation. So whoever wants to jump in.
I like to know if there's any potential, like there's interviews that you want or you're thinking of that you think may be sticky for some reason. Like, you're really this is the person you're gonna accuse of a crime. When do you reach out to them? How do you reach out to them? I wanna talk about that. If you are ever thinking of recording somebody without their knowledge, you need to talk to a lawyer first, because there are considerations about whether to do it at all. There are considerations about what state you are in, what state they are in, what platform you are using. So those are the kinds of things that if you're planning, you say, oh, I solved the crime. I kind of want to tell the police, like, no talking to law enforcement until you talk to the lawyer first, because we don't want to make you like an arm of law enforcement accidentally. If the police is like, oh, why don't you ask them this in your next interview? Like, no, you want to anytime. So I like to kind of troubleshoot ahead of time. Like, I like to get a cast. Like, who are you interviewing? Who's cooperating? Who's maybe not cooperating? A lot of distributors ask you to have a release from somebody who's sitting down voluntarily for an interview. Not because it's legally required, but because it's kind of a business practice. It just makes it easier to license down the road. It makes it easier for insurance. So, what are the expectations of your distributor? What are you required to do? Because it is, I tell you, much easier to have something that's pretty not scary and hand it to them when they sit down for the interview than chasing them afterwards. And you want to be careful also about not saying, hey, we need you to sign this thing or else we can't use it, and then create like a contractual promise that wasn't there in the first place. So anything about sources who may be difficult, or there's kind of a potential difficult approach, releases, recording, any kind of, sting or involving law enforcement in any way. I think being able to talk through the process first, because by the time you get the cut, it's way too late, and you just kind of work with the facts on the ground. And since I do both the back end before it comes out and also litigate it, I really like to set up the facts that I'm going to have to deal with later, or someone will have to deal with later, so we can make it easier on the if anything happens down the road. So planning ahead.
Yeah, that's really good to know. And I teach a lot of IP and entertainment law classes here. And that's what the big thing we focus on the students is understanding how releases work and understanding to be forward thinking with all of this. But going in that direction, particularly, Michael, what are you seeing? What would you be advising people to be looking at?
Yeah. Well, I can't be your lawyer, but I can give you information. So I would say, to all the things Allison said, plus I just want to emphasize sources, anonymous sources, or what lawyers call confidential sources. This is an area, there are some areas in media law where there are a lot of great protections for journalists, for storytellers, sources. Source protections are not great. Okay, as an ethical matter, and as lawyers, we deal a lot with, ethics matters, but also, legal matters, of course. As an ethical matter, there's a sort of an absolute promise that a lot of folks doing journalism on documentaries want to make, which is we will protect you. We will never reveal your identity. This is an area where the law doesn't really line up with the ethics, in that whether there's protection that you would have if you got a subpoena for the identity of that source, or for notes or conversations you've had with that source, depends on the state. And it depends on which part of the US you're in terms of what circuit court of appeals in the federal system. And it's very complicated. And so I think where the Justice Department has said, okay, we're now going to really consider subpoenaing journalists for their sources, you really need to be prepared in advance. And here's why. Transparency. Why transparency? Because identifying a source in your story is all about transparency. People who are your viewers or listeners, for me often, want to know who the sources are, so that they can vet the information and see if they agree with it. But you also want to be transparent with sources. And saying something like, I will protect you always and forever, is a promise that is not necessarily backed up by the law, that you have to stand behind. And so you want to think about having conversations with sources that get a little bit more into the details. Like, what does it mean to be an anonymous source? Does it mean you're off the record? Does it mean you're on deep background? Like, defining those terms. Are there situations where you, as the storyteller who knows the identity of the source, are willing to go to jail to protect that source? That is ultimately the question with some of these sources. And I think you have to have those conversations ahead of time with sources. So, and what I think is important to know is that there are a lot of, and maybe not as many, but there are people who are brave, who are sources, who have important information, who in some instances are willing to raise their hand and say, you know what, if it's a choice between you going to jail or me coming out and identifying myself, I will identify myself. Or they'll say, I would expect you to go to jail. And you're having that conversation beforehand, right? And so it's kind of grim to be thinking of that far down the line, but it's super important because you want a situation where you and the sources are on the same page. And that's sort of one of the most important things you can do. Is so if there is a subpoena later or a litigation or something, it's not a surprise where they're like, wait, I thought you'd protect me, when you might not be able to. And so I think that's hard to do, but having those conversations beforehand, I think you'd be surprised at how many brave people who are willing to tell the truth and deal with the consequences for it. And there's, getting back to hope, like there's some hope in that.
Just one quick thing. Absolutely, and I completely agree. Plus, I find that for documentarians and storytellers, it strengthens your bond, with that source up front, which helps the whole story. Please, Mary.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's a temptation as filmmakers, and I get it, is that everybody loves the David and Goliath story. So going to ethics, and I'm a lawyer, I'm not a media lawyer, I'm a whistleblower lawyer. But I think there's a temptation that we want to tell the story through a person, right? Because it's very hard to have an anonymous source. So I think what I've observed is lots of journalists I respected, incredibly respected outlets, almost befriend whistleblowers. You have to know, so I'm speaking from my vantage point of a lawyer who represents whistleblowers, so whistleblower sources, that they kind of worry that if I refer this source to a lawyer, which they may need, then the story is going to go away, right? Those lawyers are going to tell them to clamp down. And that's a really vulnerable place to be in, because I've seen far too frequently whistleblowers who go and their story, they become a files, right? I represent Mark McGann of the Uber files, Francis Haugen of the Facebook files, right? Tyler Schultz is one of my clients, and Tyler wanted to be anonymous. So here's a story of John Kerry, one of the finest journalists we know. When he was looking at the documents, when he gave them over to Theranos to comment, there was a calculation in there that only Tyler had done, and it was a fingerprint to Tyler, right? So even when you have the best intentions, this sort of stuff happens. So I just think that I would really encourage people to think about lawyers as friends. There's a lot of very open-minded lawyers who represent whistleblowers. Margot's organization, my firm, where we want to make sure they have employment counsel, maybe they've been retaliated against, but before they become the next Uber files, I want to make sure they've gone to the government first, or maybe Congress, to protect their information. I'm in a much stronger position if I've shared this information with the government and received certain protections than otherwise. And so I've just seen some very talented journalists stiff-arm lawyers until after the story breaks, and I really think that that's problematic, and I would encourage folks to, there's Blueprint for Free Speech has a whole section on how to deal with whistleblower sources. There's a brand new resource out of Signals and RJI, and so I would encourage folks to not look at us as enemies, but as obstacles as part of those candid conversations that we want them to get the story out. And I'll end by saying one of the best panels I ever did here was we represented, my colleagues represented Ed Pearson, one of the Boeing 737 MAX whistleblowers. And because of double exposure, I watched a panel with Kareem Amr, who did The Great Hack, and because he had handled Brittany Kaiser so well, that's the Cambridge Analytica scandal, for those of you who hadn't seen it, we met afterwards, and he said, "Mary, do you have any whistleblowers I could follow right now in real time? Because I don't want to go after." I was like, actually, Ed Pearson is about to hop on a plane and go from anonymity into the spotlight and speak in front of Congress. You want to follow him? So I persuaded, in full disclosure, a reluctant client who was very unhappy with what the Federal Transportation Authority and sort of what we all saw seemed to be too tight of a regulator with Boeing on, oh, this is just a software error, when we know that now doors are falling off of planes and other things. We persuaded him, and he did a panel with us at Double Exposure saying the best thing he ever did in terms of his empowerment was get to tell his own story in flight risk. So I'm a huge proponent of documentaries being a huge, great vehicle for many of my clients who get to finally tell their full story, not just how the regulators and the sausage is made and that it didn't quite work. So a lot of us want to get our clients in front of the lens at the right time, assuming they want to. So I just wanted to say that so you don't think that all of us are out there saying we don't want our whistleblowers to come to you. We do. They have great stories to tell, but there should be a process we follow that lets us do our magic behind the scenes first.
I'll just jump in to say, absolutely, one of the things that you got to tell sources is, I'm not your lawyer, and you should go talk to a lawyer, and they're not scary, they're there to help. The other thing is, digital hygiene is super important, and got Signals Foundations here. I mean, one of the ways you protect your sources, you have to be great on digital hygiene. You cannot leave metadata around. You have to use secure communications as much as possible. And sometimes that means you have to meet in person in the parking garage, their deep throat, right? So I'll just stop there.
No, that's really great. Please, Al.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, yeah, I think what you identified as real, like you don't want to lose the story. And so there's this like, oh, if I tell them to go to a lawyer, they're going to, but not only am I not the source's lawyer, my advice cannot be conveyed to the source by the journalist as like, oh, our lawyers say, because like you can't say that to a source, and especially things like.
Because it's a conflict of interest.
Well, because it's revealing my privilege, it's waiving attorney-client privilege is what it is. It's also a real problem because in this situation there is a conflict because most of these sources are deciding to breach an NDA of some sort, and they may have personal employment or, national security implications for them that do not extend to the journalists. However, if the journalist is out there promising them things in order to breach it, that could bring them outside of kind of the protections where we think of it as, the information that comes over the transom. Someone violates their NDA, gives you some information. The journalist is protected, or the filmmaker, for publicizing that. But once you start getting involved with the actual breaking of the law or the contract, you could potentially get tagged with a tortious interference or other kind of, contractual or federal violation. And so it's really important, like I tell them, they have to make the decision to come to you, and you cannot be part of, you cannot convince them and offer them money, offer to defend them if they get sued, offer to, vet it, read their NDA and advise them whether they are violating it. We can't promise you fame and fortune that will make it, impossible for anyone to go after you. Like those kinds of things are very fraught, but a lot of, because of this, it's a really intimate relationship in a lot of ways, developing a source. And these are people that you care about and you want to protect, like as a person too, not just as a, journalist. And I think it's very hard to kind of keep that professional distance. So for me, I always want a source to be represented by someone like Mary, because then I know that they're being advised well. And it's not just about like getting the story out and then it's done, because if you screw over your source and then there's blowback afterwards, that's part of the story of your film too. Your film is the one that your source went to jail, and then that overshadows your story. So it becomes a legal issue. It also becomes a comms issue for you. It makes it harder for people to trust you in the future. It may make it harder for your distributor. If you have a professional distributor, they don't want to be caught up in something like that. And so like lawyers, part of my job is to try to think of everything bad that could possibly happen and address it beforehand. So it's like really good for people with anxiety. It's just like just catnip to this profession. But like that's part of what my job is, because it's not over once you put it out into the world. It continues to become a story, and it's not helpful to anyone. It's not helpful to your source, and it's not helpful to you if it's like if there's a surprise later. Because it'll still redound against you. So.
Thank you. And I think that goes back to the bigger point, which is all of these things strengthen your relationship as the storyteller with your source, because you're now an honest actor, and that's better for now. And I think, Allison, you make a great point. Your whole career as a storyteller is your integrity. And if you blow that, then it's almost impossible to get it back. So I don't want to leave you out, Renee, if you wanted to add to that.
Oh, well, I think my only other suggestions will be vastly more boring than what was just discussed about how to protect sources, which is just one other thing we recommend people think about as they're starting to work on these sort of sensitive projects, are document retention policies. It's ideal to have a sort of consistent policy about when you do or do not delete unused footage, internal communications, communications with sources, things like that, in addition to the digital security elements of that Mike already mentioned in terms of what platforms are you doing this on, and are those encrypted, things like that. Just when you delete them, there are some competing considerations you might want to consider when crafting those policies. You know, the risk of a subpoena, if it's high, you might be best served by deleting things a little bit earlier, but then there's also practical considerations of wanting to retain those things for, you know, completing your documentary, as well as defending against an allegation of defamation. You want to be able to show that you did diligence in your news gathering and filming and gathering facts. So it's really a case-by-case assessment on what a policy should actually look like, but it's very much worth putting thought into early on in the process before you start gathering massive amounts of information and talking to sensitive sources and things like that.
And also things like, I'm crossing borders, I'm going to be filming at, you know, customs as I'm going across, like having conversations about where are you storing, are you gonna use a burner, like laptop or something, put all your stuff in the cloud so that it's not physically on your device, and if there's nothing there, there's nothing there. Do not have your stuff unlockable with with your face recognition or your thumb or your hand, where they can just like put it in front of your face, like passcodes, because there's a difference between making you give up your passcode and putting it in front of your face. Legally, they're not supposed to do it, but I don't trust, just as having practical barriers to the gathering of information and not just relying on the law, I think is important. But it's also like, I'm gonna be doing this thing in this small town in Tennessee. The mayor may not like it. You know, the Reporters Committee lawyers have contacts, and sometimes it's like, I'm gonna find you a local criminal lawyer. Here's his number. If you get in trouble, you know, he's in the Rotary Club with the mayor, that's who you want to call. Not me in DC, but you want to have kind of thinking about who your on the ground contacts are and try to set that up if you're going to be doing something that could get you into trouble. Just having a person to call is really important.
Absolutely, thank you. And that's a great transition to where I was going to go next, which is, and it's come up many times, this idea of, and I think most people don't understand this, the idea of things really differ state by state. Defamation law is not national. And so where you report, what you do, and because of course now everything's reaching out to people across states, so that came up in whether you're recording. Obviously we've talked, and maybe someone can address the issue of what SLAPP lawsuits are, how those work, I think would be really valuable. So if somebody wants to jump in with that, maybe I'll turn to you, Micah, to start.
SLAPP lawsuits, okay, yeah, great. So SLAPP, so they're anti-SLAPP laws. SLAPPs are strategic lawsuits against public participation. Okay, so SLAPPs are bad, and anti-SLAPP laws are good. There's a lot of there's some negatives in there. So just so you know that. So basically, it is really expensive to defend a libel lawsuit, and people who are suing for libel, so libel plaintiffs, know that. And so what they often do is bring a frivolous lawsuit. So something that is just, you know, it's not going to eventually win, but they want to make the cost so high early on that you're sort of forced into bankruptcy or forced to settle. And the goal of that, it's not even really about the money. It is to intimidate people who are telling the truth and sort of weaponize the judicial system to silence them, essentially, right? So kind of a esoteric concept, but it's a thing that has happened for a long time. California was the first, but they're now, I don't know, around 30.
There's a new one in Delaware.
There's a new one in Delaware.
Really good, and that's important because everyone's a Delaware corporation.
Right. So these laws are in a bunch of states, not every state, and what they essentially allow you to do is get attorney's fees from the other side if they bring a frivolous claim.
And you win.
And you win, right? There are some other things that you get, like you can appeal earlier in some places, or you can get discovery stopped in some places. But they can be helpful really early on, even before the litigation gets going, to say, look, you don't really want to bring this claim because you're at risk if you do. It's not that I'm at risk as much, you're at risk. And they can be really, really helpful. Now, it depends on the state. It depends on what court you're in. So in DC, we've got an anti-SLAPP law that is available in state court, but it's not available in federal court. And there are a lot of places like that. And so plaintiffs are smart and they'll go to federal court, right? It's not like a panacea, but they can be really helpful. And you have to talk to a lawyer who does this nationally, like Allison, or in the local state, to understand what rights that anti-SLAPP law may give you.
We really want a federal anti-SLAPP law.
We really do. And there's not one yet. It's been pushed. But again, what is so valuable about it is, wealthy people, wealthy corporations use these, lawsuits because it's so expensive and it's so emotionally draining to be sued, and they can keep you in court for 10 plus years if they want to, but having this legislation allows you to quickly get rid of this and then turn it against them. So it's really valuable. So as you're addressing this, when you're talking to people, this whole idea of state, what are the things that come to mind? What are the things, again, because we have so many documentarians here that people should know about in terms of this, in terms of some of the other issues that you've been dealing with? I know, Mike, you must have this constantly with what you're doing and the reporters, and nationally and internationally.
With SLAPPs, you
Yeah,
mean?
with SLAPPs, but also with other state-by-state things that people should know about.
I think the general, yes, talk to a lawyer. In general, you can't, a SLAPP is a good tool, but it's not a thing to rely on, because you don't know who your plaintiff is, you don't know where they're going to sue. You can't just be like, well, it's fine because. So, that's a good thing to have, but since it's not 100% coverage, it's not like it's a tool for later, not for planning ahead. For things like recording, I think generally defaulting to the least protective regime is always the best way to do it. So don't, if you're recording somebody, always getting their permission or letting them know, doing it openly, is always going to be your safest practice. And if there's a reason that you don't want to do that, that's when you want to involve a lawyer and have conversations about where everyone is. Sometimes once I had somebody bring up sports to kind of get an idea of the local, where they were, or the weather, to understand, to get some documentation of where they were physically.
I had a client who is, the GPS was telling where they were as they were going, so that.
Yeah, but that's, if you were to get into a fight over that in court, that's a 5 to 6 figure set of motions there when you're getting into facts about where somebody is. So you can be right, but it's going to cost you 6 figures. And if you don't have, and it's hard to get, it's very hard, it's much easier to get pro bono advice pre-publication and pre-broadcast than it is to get pro bono representation for a major lawsuit. So even if you're in a, it is better to either get some discreet advice for some flat fee, or pro bono is just there's much more availability. It's much harder to get that kind of representation after the fact. And so, yeah, I think just doing good, being an ethical and good filmmaker, journalist is really the best protection. The actual malice standard, which says don't publish things that you know are false, that's not a ceiling, that's a floor. And I think it's probably, we want to do that for everyone. But the negligence standard is do a good job, be as good as kind of what your industry and your profession would want you to do. And so doing good ethical more than is required is always going to be the best legal protection too, and is good for you, again, in terms of your reputation, your integrity. So I think just following best practices is really the best thing you can do for legal protection as well.
People want to jump in.
Oh, yeah, go.
No, I was just going to say, in terms of state by state, in terms of source protection, I know a lot of you come up against NDAs. That's a state by state analysis. So there have been some really brave whistleblowers, a whistleblower named Afoma Zoma, who got the Silence No More Act passed in California and Washington State that allow you to make NDAs unenforceable, allow you to talk about certain subjects, including discrimination, obviously sexual assault, but even wrongdoing. We've seen in England, for those of you who, and in Canada, there's a new group called Can't Buy My Silence. They've also gotten legislation passed in the UK, which is on this sort of score, and it looks like Canada may go that way. So it is state by state, though.
And then I'll first underscore 10 times what Allison said about pro bono being easier to find in advance of a lawsuit being filed than after the fact. That's very important to note, and something that comes up often at the Reporters Committee. And another state-by-state issue is subpoena defense. So there's something called the reporter's privilege that is often a state statutory privilege. So if you get issued a subpoena in a state with a reporter's privilege law, you might have an extra defense against having to disclose your source identity or give away your unused footage, whatever the subpoena seeks. But that does vary state by state, and not all states have it, nor is there a federal one at this time. I will also emphasize that it matters a lot what court issues the subpoena to your lawyer. So like the deadlines for responding to a subpoena can be very fast. So ideally you would have talked to a lawyer if you are concerned about the risk of a subpoena in advance, but if you haven't, the second anyone in your organization gets handed a subpoena, you very much need to contact a lawyer, because it can be a 14-day deadline to file objections, and if you miss that deadline, the consequences can be significant. Sig mentioned a lot of my job at the Reporters Committee is rapid response to legal issues faced by journalists, and a large percentage of that is subpoenas, because a journalist gets a subpoena, doesn't know what it is or what to do about it, calls me, and then we have 10 or 14 days to find them a lawyer to respond, or respond ourselves, and as much time as possible is very important in those situations. So I'll just emphasize the time sensitivity of that, and that the timing can also vary state by state in a lot of situations.
And a lot of SLAPP laws also have a specific time that you have to file that in. And so you get these and it's stressful, and I just urge that if you get a legal thing, this is not a thing to kind of put away and be like, I'll deal with that next week. No. Call, Reporters Committee or somebody, just get the clock, because the clock is ticking, and you want to have as much time on your side as possible to have the most options available.
Thank you very much. I get that a lot from people about the state-by-state laws, and it's very confusing. I want to open it up to Q&A. I know I've got a lot of people who specifically wanted to get here, so if you have a question, if you want to stand up, raise a hand, and we'll take it. They're probably also like, wow, that's a lot of information. Anybody? Do we have any? Yes, please. We're going to get you a microphone. Yeah. And if you could just please introduce yourself.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Barbara Rabb, and I work at the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation. We're a small foundation in Berkeley, and we do fund documentary film. And the questions that I have are actually questions that I don't know if there are other funders in the room, but one thing that struck me as you were talking is, in this climate, should funders be worried about being included in, let's say, a libel lawsuit for basically enabling a film? I'd like to know if you have seen that, and if so, how can we protect ourselves? And then my second question, if you have time, is I think sometimes it can be helpful in funding applications, grant applications, to actually ask certain questions. And this panel has made me think that maybe we should add to our application a question like, have you, I don't know exactly how I would phrase it, but basically, do you think it would be helpful for filmmakers to have to at least address a question when they're looking for funding, particularly at the start of a project, to answer a question from a funder. And if the answer is no, we haven't done anything, we hadn't even thought about that, then we can actually assist them. It's not a prerequisite to a grant, but at least it puts that issue on the table.
I think that's a really interesting, I think yes to all of that. I always tell people I can't control who's going, like I can't control other people's bodies, like I tell my 5-year-old, but I can't control who's going to sue you. But I think there would certainly be a strong defense that you didn't publish just because you funded. That said, again, to be right is expensive. And I think this is, again, I will beat this drum forever, is where insurance is important. And I think maybe one place that it could be really helpful at the funder level, because that's, you have more of the financial and kind of pull more than like an independent filmmaker is like when we talk about collective action, having some kind of creating an E&O product for these kinds of projects and having that access for your funded projects have access to this particular, underwriting for this kind of policy. It can come with, are you working with counsel? Let us recommend some counsel. We will include in, let's put into your budget, because you're getting funding, you're putting together a budget. Let's make sure there's a line item in there for pre-broadcast review. I mean, I think all of that, and sometimes having the budget for legal on the front end will make it, then it can make it easier to get the project insured. And so having those kinds of things in place more institutionally, having like a policy that's been hammered out, this is the things we want, this is what we want to see, here are some insurers that we think, that we want to work with. It's business for them. It's helpful for you because it protects you. It gets them new clients who also, they don't have to individually necessarily vet. You're bringing in people who say, these are people who are going to have legal in their budget. They're going to work with, qualified counsel. All those things can make it a win-win and help kind of attack this whack-a-mole collective action problem where people make a whole thing and then at the end they're like, oh, I can't get insurance. Now it's going to be really scary to put this out, and then it makes it harder to get distribution. So, and I think that also just democratizes the ability to make films, and it's not just, you have the money to do it.
Yeah, I'll just add, as a lawyer for a nonprofit, I love your question. Because we deal with grants, and many funders view legal services as kind of overhead, and maybe they don't want to pay those, or do they make decisions about that? I want to emphasize that legal services they're a part of the production, just like cameras are. I mean, there's a reason this is the first panel here. This is part of the process, always. It's not an extra, it's not a nice to have. And so including those line items for, however much money for insurance, for speaking with outside counsel is fair use review, so copyright issues it's fundamental. And so it's not, I just want to emphasize that, especially nonprofits or, there's not much money to spare. And when you're looking at a grant, you're like, that's all you can spend. It's a great question, and I think it's something that funders can really help filmmakers and documentarians with by just including that as part of it.
I also think it's a great question. Just speaking again, the sole hat that I wear as a whistleblower lawyer, I can tell you that we're seeing major tech companies go and ask questions in depositions of prominent whistleblowers that funders have helped on their way, with their costs, query that. I've seen document requests that ask about all the funders behind a particular whistleblower. So they're saber rattling for sure.
Yeah. Please. Who's next? There's a person in the back. Raise your hand.
Hi, a real quick question. My name is Ricardo Sandoval Palos. I'm the public editor for PBS. And earlier this year at the Logan Symposium in Berkeley, we had a conversation about whistleblower protections, and we presented the story of Terry Albury, the ex-FBI agent who came out and spearheaded some amazing work. The other panelist was Kathleen McClellan from Whisper, and just before we got on stage, she confided to me that she was a little bit outraged at having heard a previous panel talk about extolling the virtues of what ProPublica was doing during the federal layoffs and the whole Doge episode, is by being out there and encouraging folks to come out and tell us your story, and bringing a van out even for that. And she was concerned that we were inviting people to literally break the law. And so that led to a pretty interesting conversation that we had subsequently about what are the alternatives. And I'm wondering that from your perspectives, are there alternatives to this kind of approach? How do we approach this kind of a situation, which is really a rich environment for journalists and documentarians? And I'm wondering, how do we wrestle with this question? What do we do?
Please, you want to grab that?
I mean, I think ethics are really important. Okay, I mean, if is having conversations with sources and getting your sources, cultivating the sources in a way that you can feel comfortable is ethically appropriate. First, the ethics first, because there are certain things that are legal that are not ethical to do. There are certain things that are ethical that are not legal to do, and we talked about a couple. And so I think, especially with sources, is the ethics have to come first. There may be sources who are willing to come forward, and you as a storyteller, filmmaker, journalist, may not feel comfortable telling their story because you're worried about the risk that they faced. It's not to be paternalistic. It is, as a journalist, you've done a lot of stories, you may have a sense of this is actually, I don't think this is safe for this person, and you have a conversation with the source about it. And so I think it's respect for the sources. It is also respect for your audience, and leads back to integrity, right? So I think it's really important. It's an individual thing of what certain organizations or independent filmmakers are willing to do ethically. What are the principles that guide you? And sometimes choosing not to tell the story because the potential harm to the sources or to the public or anything is not worth it.
Yeah, I mean, this touches on the comments that we made earlier, which is just that, you know, whistleblowers in particular are, like many sources, are in extremis, right? They are triggered because they have been, as we all now know, gaslit. So when, in terms of ethics, when a journalist is approaching you in this environment, they may not have their rational brain thinking, they may still be in reptilian mode, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. And so, you know, I often, when I'm working with whistleblowers whose initial instinct is like, I'm going to sue. Like, I'm going to blow the whistle. If I'm lucky enough, as you said, to be able to do this proactively, the horse isn't already out of the barn. And I involve their families in that decision because they are not always thinking about the repercussions, right? We all know that you may never work in this industry again. So you may feel personally harmed and you're ready to, you know, you're in a defensive crouch and you want to lash out. That may not be the best decision. So I do think that I'm very suspect, as you were, of what feels in many ways as predatory behavior of people who've been gaslit or looking to journalists for friendship. They don't have a lawyer, and we had talked about this earlier, that just, I think media assumes that if I tell my source to talk to a lawyer, then they'll never speak to me. And that's not the case, but I think we're just in that environment again.
Anybody else? No? I think we have time for one last question. We're going to go here. Here we go. Proximity to the panel. There you go.
Hi, Lex Moore. I'm a graduate student over at Hopkins in film. I had a question about the digital hygiene that you mentioned. So you mentioned protecting sources and making sure that there isn't any metadata, meeting in person in a parking garage, et cetera. How would you maintain digital hygiene if you have an international source in this climate?
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the most protective things to do are to meet in person, but you can't always do that. So, I mean, there are reasons why there's a Signal app, for example. I mean, there's no digital tool that is absolutely safe, and you have to be clear about that. But there are digital tools that can help, and when you're dealing with an international source, having a platform like Signal where there's encryption, there's privacy and security by design.
There's nothing retained.
There's very little metadata, and not really useful metadata that's retained. You have to be vigilant about using those kinds of platforms, and using only air-gapped computers in certain instances. I mean, you want to do your homework, talk to digital security experts if you have access to them to really make a plan. You have to do sort of a risk analysis of what are you trying to protect against, what are the capabilities of the folks you're trying to protect against, what are the tools that I might have to protect against those kinds of risks, and do those things, have a risk assessment, and then you want to have discussions with the source about the limits of those capabilities.
I would
Go ahead. No.
I would say that there's a great source. Truthteller.life is the Extinction Rebellion's environmental whistleblower hotline, and they have a fabulous page that walks you right through all of that. But I can tell you that digital hygiene for a lot of your sources is going to be what documents do they provide you. And I cannot tell you how many people will still put a jump drive in or will still send all their emails home to their Gmail address. The only thing, and I'm not telling secrets, Frances Haugen, I think had a special device and took pictures, thousands, till she got like repetitive stress disorder of the documents. You can only take documents if you're an employee that are in your purview. You can't go outside it. You have to go with a scalpel. And even when so I think we're under the illusion that just taking pictures, they're wise to that, the companies now. So, if you've got there's surveillance cameras in every room, right? So unless you're working from home with your camera off, yeah. Oh yeah, or if you're on the Wi-Fi when they take the picture. So there's just so many traps for the unwary, which is why we've all gone back to analog, which is come show me where we leave no trace and we sit knee to knee. That's kind of the environment that we've kind of gone back to.
I would also say, just getting back to that, there's a difference between your digital hygiene and your source's digital hygiene, and you should not be instructing your source. That's where it's helpful for them to have a lawyer. But when it's one thing to talk more generally, but to say, can you take pictures of these documents? That's when you start to lose the protections of your of whatever your source may be tagged with for violating, an NDA. The other thing we can do all this talk over Signal and all that, but then you put the cuts of your documentary on Google Drive, and you don't have an enterprise, you use the free version of Google Documents, that's a huge pain point, because that means that someone could send a subpoena to Google for your stuff because they have it. And so understanding where your cloud storage is, what you are, it's probably going to mean paying for it. Do not use the free version unless it's something that's very, privacy first, kind of security, making sure that nobody can get us, that if there's a subpoena for it, you would always be notified. They won't turn it over without your permission. Really kind of reading those terms and conditions. Another resource, I think it's Freedom of the Press Foundation. has a really, really good, like, in-depth guide about, like, if you're crossing borders, if you're, like, about digital security. So I'd highly recommend checking out their website as well.
Yeah, and Freedom of the Press Foundation also has a guide on how to make Signal more secure, for example. So there's, that's a great organization.
And just on the international source point, Allison mentioned border crossings earlier, and I just want to emphasize that again. If the reporter or the source is crossing the border into the United States at any time, that is an especially important time to be very conscious of your digital security, because customs authorities have much more power at the border to search electronic devices. And so there are lots of steps that you can take to scrub your devices of sensitive information, and in part, your power to consent or not consent to that kind of search might depend on your immigration status, so that's something to keep in mind, and ideally, maybe talk to an attorney about before the border crossing happens.
And we haven't said the special word cybersecurity here. When Allison said the word Google Drive, that just makes the hair on the back of my neck go up, because when we're dealing with sources more and more now, whistleblowers are coming to us from China. And so we're subject to attack now. So, and I know a lot of nonprofits, if you have budgets and you're scrappy, you're on Google Docs, you're eminently hackable. So I would say everyone wants to use Google. I would say no. And in situations like ours, where you have to get cybersecurity insurance, they're not going to be pretty happy about that. They may not insure you if you're not using different
And it
secure
depends
systems.
on the project. Like, not every project needs, like, James Bond level, like, you can, but sometimes they do. And so I think, like, having an interplay between having enough precautions to make sure that you can tell the story without making it impossible to tell the story, and really calibrating that to your project is important too.
I would love to go much further. I know we have more questions. Unfortunately, we don't have time, but there's another great panel following this. But I do want to thank our bond level security attorneys who have been with us. Let's hear it for them. Thank you all so much.
Thanks to each of you, and thanks to SIG for doing this. I wanted to just take a minute, because of the relevance for this, to say there is a pro bono legal clinic on Saturday at 11:30. So if you are facing any specific issues for which you would like to speak to an attorney, the attorneys who are participating have all agreed to at least consider representing people pro bono on an ongoing basis. So it's a great opportunity to get together, ask some questions. You're going to get a newsletter in a little while. It'll have a link to the form. A lot of people have already signed up, but if you missed it before, we're going to send it again. And it asks you to talk about what are the issues you're facing, so they can tailor their remarks in the session to the things that are really happening in your life right now. So I just urge you all to take a look at that, and if you're still here on Saturday, which I hope you are, to attend. Thanks a bunch, and I'm going to just go ahead and actually welcome the next panel, because we lost some time and we're trying to make up. So